Thank you for joining, everybody. Sorry about the little bit of delay here until we got the Macintosh up and running. But basically today is a DeployR technical preview session. It's a bit of a follow-up session from last year's webinar. We will have a link to that one in the first few slides here, where we are going through quite a bit of the basics. We're probably not going to go through so much of the stuff that we did last time, but there will be some of a repeat for people who didn't attend. I'll take a look in a little bit on the poll to see how many people attended the previous one to see if we need to adjust. But without further ado, we can probably get going. My name is Andreas Hammarskjöld. I sit in Sweden, and together with me in this session is Michael Niehaus, who sits out in Seattle for a couple of more hours before he flies to Europe, I think. And we're going to take you through what we've been working on since mostly the last sort of the session. You want to go through the agenda?
Yeah, sure. So we'll do a recap of kind of the positioning and where we see DeployR fitting, then talk about how we're thinking about packaging it and making it available to customers. Then we'll spend some time on the technologies and demos, and lastly finish up with availability and timeframes. Hopefully we'll have time for Q&A left at the end, so feel free to jump in anytime. We'll be watching the chat as well, but we'll probably have time at the end for any more detailed questions too.
This makes sense. And I see from the poll that we have about 70% of the people that are attending today did not attend the previous webinar. So it probably makes sense that we cover some of it. I put a link to it up here. It's on our YouTube channel that you can find either by searching 2 Point Software in YouTube or via our homepage. We haven't done that yet, but we're going to upload the old Q&A result set to the Reddit thread so that you can get a good Q&A session there. We've been trying to get it to our website, but that seemed impossible. So we'll get that Q&A, and we'll get this Q&A recording as well. So if you do have questions, don't type them in the regular chat, put them into the Q&A. And even though you don't get an answer at this session, if we're running out of time, you will get an answer, and we'll answer all of the questions after the sessions if we don't have time. So without further ado, let's move on.
All right. One of the first things that often comes up with people when we start talking about DeployR is, why do I want to do bare metal OSD anyway? I thought that was dead, that we've moved on to modern processes, but at the end of the day, there still are scenarios where you need it. So we can start off just by kind of enumerating those. The main scenarios that we're looking at, the use cases that we're looking at, is as an MDT replacement. So you've got MDT going out of support in the near future. You still have a need for doing something like that. So there's an obvious case. If you are looking at the modern processes for provisioning a device around Intune and Autopilot, and you're currently using SCCM for OSD, there are a lot of customers out there that look at that and say, I want to keep SCCM around just to do OSD. Is there anything more lightweight that we could use instead? And then the third one really is just the case where you don't have a good or supported bare metal OSD solution at present. Maybe you're using something else that's already obsolete or heading that direction, and you're just looking at alternatives. The imaging itself you may want to do because you are doing break fix, you need to get a device back up and running, or you are not happy with the OS image that's been pre-installed on a device from the OEM, or you're trying to recover from a disaster like imagine CrowdStrike, but only worse. So all of those scenarios really play into the use cases that we're targeting. So trying to make it simple to set up and use, but at the same time familiar with what you're already probably using today. So what is DeployR? Well, it is that bare metal OS deployment solution using a task sequence engine, very similar to what's used by SCCM and MDT. It has a web-based user administration, user interface for administration. So everything you are maintaining will be maintained through a website. We expect it to be a community platform so that it's not just content that we provide or content that you create, but also we want to make it easy to consume content that others have created. Obviously, still a work in progress for us. There's lots of work to be done. We'll talk about what we've done, what we're still working on. Behind the scenes, we expect to use the same engine for a variety of different things because, as you've probably seen in the past, task sequences are useful in scenarios other than just bare metal deployment. So we'll see other uses come up as we go, but that's kind of the positioning overall. We're still in the early days, so it's a great time to provide feedback on specific things that you would like to see, features that you would like. So if there's anything that you don't see or would like to stress as we go through this, feel free to add it into the chat or bring it up in the Q&A as well.
So,
Andreas, do you want to talk about the stack?
So basically, when we started the whole DeployR journey, we knew that we had a lot of functionality in our already existing code bases that sort of had an overlap and it would be an integration point with DeployR. So we've been working quite heavily, even though we haven't necessarily been done that work in DeployR, is to move a lot of that stuff over. So in the previous webinar, we covered a lot of the pure DeployR pieces. I think if you move forward, I made a little scribble that'll animate nicely. Yes, you see how nicely it animates. But basically today we'll probably cover some more of the other pieces as well. That doesn't mean that just because it's not in the green box that you won't get your hands on it, but the feature and functionality is in other parts of our code base. So we'll cover some of that later today if the demos don't take too much long time.
So the core components, we already talked about task sequencing engine. Obviously, as part of the task sequencing, we need to persist state through the whole process. So just like a current MDT task sequence would have task sequence variables, we do the same thing where we can set those and make sure that the values persist from Windows PE and into the full OS and across reboots and all that fun stuff. We'll display progress as we go along. Instead of using VBScript or anything else like you've seen in the past, everything is PowerShell based. We're using PowerShell 7, so trying to move to modern scripting technologies. On the server side, we have a database that stores all of the task sequence step definitions and the task sequences themselves, along with content items and the details around all of the content that we're managing. Everything is exposed via a set of web services, and we have a website for administration that we'll see in the future. We're still working on then hooking in online services to provide a sort of community hub so that you can publish content for others to consume, subscribe and download samples or scripts or other things to enhance your own task sequences and really collaborate with others to make this a more community-driven solution as well. We discovered as well, really through years of experience with MDT and Config Manager, that Some versioning would be useful as well to handle the normal process of going from a test environment or pre-production environment into production. So everything that we do inside of task sequences and with content items and really everything else inside of DeployR is versioned so that we can make that a much easier process to go through. With that, we should probably talk more about packaging. We expect to have two different versions of DeployR, an enterprise version with all the functionality, and then a community version that will have some some things that may not be there. As far as what the exact breakdown is between those two, we're still working on that, but the expectation is the enterprise version provides full support and includes iPixie Anywhere. The community version wouldn't include support, but may have other functionality differences. Understanding that from the perspective of the rest of the 2Pint products is really key overall. So it's worth spending some time really digging into how these pieces fit together into the bigger puzzle.
And I think one of the things that we've discovered lately is like we've been working a lot around our Pixie infrastructure and seeing what we can do there. So we haven't decided not to release a Pixie working version of Pixie. Depends a little bit what happens with our friends in Redmond and how the whole also secure boot landscape moves and changes going forward to see what we can do around that. But we wanting to give you, utilizing our already built product set, something that sort of is good enough, especially if you are on a sort of smaller infrastructure footprint, or like if you're, let's say, a school or university element where you have good connectivity, you're well defined, and you need to do a lot of batch building, etc. That we have the ability to utilize the free version for that. But then also having a paid offering that EI pays for all of the work that we're doing and giving to the community. We still have to, sadly, actually make money to pay for salaries, but there has to be a balance in between the two of them.
Yeah, and when we get to pricing and talk about per client, the expectation overall, going back to a question in the chat, is that that's really per device that you have. So just to simplify matters, just count up the number of devices. So when it comes to DeployR overall, we do have the ability to boot via iPixie, via Media, via other Pixie servers. If we were to include iPixie type capabilities into a free version, maybe that's an option at some point, but at this point, the expectation is that the DeployR Enterprise Bundle would include all of the iPixie functionality that we currently have today. Architecture support, x64, ARM64, that's a given. Peering of content that's being managed by DeployR certainly is something that we would be doing in both the enterprise and the free versions. When it gets deeper than that into the other features, I think we're still debating like what's key functionality that should be provided to everyone versus some more advanced features that would only be in the enterprise version. So you will see that get more defined in the next few months, but as of right now, we're still kind of open to tweaks. Since this all builds on top of DeployR, the DeployR platform provides the web user interface and the service management pieces for DeployR. So you would be using a version of DeployR to do that. What would be provided with DeployR, both in the enterprise and community bundles, would be basically a read-only version. So it would be able to monitor and report on bandwidth consumption, downloads, activities, things like that, but it wouldn't provide active bandwidth management or peering of internet content. Those particular pieces would be provided as part of a full DeployR license, which is available separately. So you could choose as part of the DeployR Enterprise bundle to step up and add additional things, but wouldn't be there by default. Same thing on device recovery. We're looking at firmware integrated recovery options so that you could just push a key on a device and initiate bare metal deployment even over the internet. That is expected to be a separate license as well. Andreas, anything you want to add?
No, I think there is a bunch of features that we know that we probably want to give away to the community, but they're still work in progress, basically for the enterprise bundle, such as, for instance, the whole RBAC model and a lot of the other features as well. So it's hard to tell when we're in development whether it's going to be part of the community version, right? Because we don't necessarily 100% know what the end result is going to look like. So I think this will be something that will be changing a lot over time. So just because you see something set in a slide today doesn't mean that within 6 months to a year that there is a different story around that. I think what we've been trying to focus on is to build a model that we know can scale, but also perform well enough so that we don't end up in a support nightmare to fix, issues for left, right, and center, as well as giving back to the community that we sort of come from and are part of. But without, we don't want to release a product where customer says, well, why should we buy your free offering is good enough. Why should we buy your software?
Okay. Any other questions around the versions, the relationships, the pricing? Otherwise, we can shift to the technology pieces. Okay, we'll keep going. Let's talk about the technologies then. For those that are familiar with MDT, you know it is very dependent on SMB, so basically mapped file shares to access all content. Not necessarily the greatest thing to do. So for DeployR, all the communication would be HTTPS based, so using just simple web downloads. Peering of content would leverage branch cache. So DeployR has native support for branch cache built into it. All the content that you add, whether it's operating systems, applications, driver packs, or whatever, will be peerable via branch cache. We automatically generate the necessary hashes for that, and the client understands how to do the peering of content even inside of Windows PE. We have a separate option for CDN content. So as we get into some of the demos, we'll see cases where we will download content directly from Windows Update or from OEMs. As an example, driver packs, we could download them directly from the OEM. In those cases, the content would be coming from a web server that isn't branch cache enabled. So we do have some options available to enable peering for that content, but that likely wouldn't be part of the free product. That would be a separately licensed component. Anything that we're invoking from Intune or the Windows Store or Windows Update or Office M365 apps could also be downloading using delivery optimization. So we obviously will support that as well, but that's somewhat separate from the DeployR functionality itself. It's just implicitly happening in the background as this content's being downloaded. We can certainly start the process via Pixie or from USB keys.
Yeah, and I think here is where some of the logic that we're currently discussing and debating is around the how will the different flows of communication be. We have some enterprise customers that have complicated line of sight issues between the different server and client and server configurations, basically in a multi-tiered, multi-organizational standpoint where like multiple individual customers form a larger entity where they also want to be able to run this. That is a complicated setup to support. So we're trying to figure out how can we make this robust and reliable, but also being able to easily get going, right? We don't necessarily want to be at this position where you have to like set up a PKI, etc. It's very easy to go into the sort of configuration trap logic and requirements for complicated setup, which is, I think, one of the reasons why MDT was so popular was that it was very easy to actually get going, right? So there are some things that we have to simplify in our tool set, but without risking, destroying the experience for our enterprise customers.
Okay. On the requirements front, we would expect this to run on Windows Server 2019 or above. It would be possible to run it on client OSs as well, but we typically wouldn't recommend that. We do use .NET Framework 4.8 for some components. DeployR heavily uses PowerShell 7.4 and .NET 8. We'll leverage IIS for the administrative site at present, branch cache for the peer-to-peer content sharing, ADK obviously for Windows PE. When we do Linux provisioning, bare metal deployment of Linux devices, we would be leveraging the Windows subsystem for Linux in order to generate Linux live boot images. So that would require support for nested virtualization and an OS that supports WSL. Obviously, Server 2019 and above certainly includes that support. And we want everything to be secure, so we will have a requirement for TLS certificates, so that we can enable SSL for all the communication. All the metadata used in DeployR is stored in SQL Server, so we need at least an express install of SQL Server. The data that we're storing in SQL is primarily just metadata and tracking information, so the database isn't very large. So in a lot of cases, Express is probably sufficient. But if you have your own existing SQL licenses, you could certainly use those as well.
I had a question in the chat, Michael, which and I know that we discussed earlier whether the logic has support to work on server core.
That's a good question. I think generally the answer is yes, but at the same time, we haven't tried it recently. So I think we would just need to verify that it does or doesn't. There's nothing inherently different about core from the perspective of DeployR, but yeah, that's something that we should probably try out again.
Yeah. I don't think I tested the Stifler client on server core in 6 years' time. But it did run on core eventually at one point, so I think it's probably easy for us to adjust.
All right, any other questions worth addressing? Nothing that immediately jumps out, so let's shift into demos. Just for those of you who haven't seen DeployR overall, figured it would be a good place to start with just a high-level click-through to show you the different pieces. So we would start off by navigating into deployments. We can see a DeployR node with task sequences, step definitions, and content items. The step definitions are basically the different step types that we could include in a task sequence. You could add your own to that list as well. Content items include operating systems, driver packs, applications. You'll notice that some of these are just single files, like Microsoft 365 apps just has a single file. In this case, we're reusing the Intune packaged files. So if you create an Intune package using the Intune Win app util to create an Intune Win file, and you've uploaded that to Intune, you could take that same file and import it into DeployR and then just include the same command line that you had in Intune, and we can install that directly. So we don't want you to have to put a lot of work into repackaging applications. You should just be able to use whatever format you have. If that's a folder full of files, great. Upload that folder full of files. We'll turn that into a single WIM file for efficiency and download that to the client. If that's an Intune Win file, great. Upload it. Tell us how to run it. We'll automatically download it, extract the contents from the inside, and then run the install command line against what we extracted. So lots of flexibility there. There's still additional work that we can do to add in the boot image and media creation processes into the same web interface. Today, those are done via a terminal session or a command prompt running PowerShell scripts separately, but that's still a work in progress. We will be adding in monitoring capabilities so that you can see running task sequences and downloads and peering efficiency of those. And we still have more work to do to add in support for other OSs. We've done some proof of concepts to make sure that we could boot into a Linux environment and deploy Chrome OS Flex, but there's a lot more work to be done to support other Linux distributions to enable that. There's no reason why we couldn't add other OSs into this mix. We have a few that we've been looking at potentially to add on to the normal Windows, Linux, and Chrome OS list, but we'll see how that goes and the timelines for those. All right, so let's look at something a little bit more comprehensive then. Let's try to create a bare metal task sequence. In our last webcast, we did this from scratch. Now we have enabled templates so that we can choose a pre-configured task sequence and then just tweak it for the content that we have. So we add it, click to edit, and then choose what operating system we want to deploy. So I'll do Windows 11 24H2. And then we can specify the different ways of resuming once we're in the new OS. So in this case, we'll choose Setup Complete, which is basically the way SCCM resumes task sequences. We can add in a step to install an application. So in this case, we'll install Office. I've already added Office into my environment using the Intune Win file that we were looking at before. And maybe we also want to join the device to Active Directory, so we can add an offline domain join step. We just need to specify the name of the domain that we want to join. The editor actually supports drag and drop, so we can just easily reorder steps by dragging them around. Once we've made our adjustments, we just save the changes. So we've got the drag and drop editing. We can use those Intune Win32 apps. We can resume in multiple ways. MDT used auto logon, so it automatically would log on as a local administrator account and do the rest of the configuration like that. SCCM used setup complete, so it runs after Ubi completes. We've also added in support for audit mode, so you can have the machine boot into audit mode where it's logging on to the local administrator account without a password and doing customizations and then resealing the OS to continue from there. And we could do specialized commands as well. So before Ubi even starts, use run synchronous commands in the specialized phase to do the customization. After debating for a while, well, do we behave like MDT? Do we behave like SCCM? Do we do something different? We basically just said, well, let's just do all of them. It's not that hard for us to automatically generate the needed unattended templates to support each one of those. So based on your choice, we'll generate an unattended for you that has the needed settings to drive the process. In the case of the offline domain join, we're actually letting the DeployR server create the computer object. So it's doing blob creation in Active Directory and then sending that blob back to the client. So you don't need to provide any credentials on the client to join the device into Active Directory. We can take care of that server side. So what does this look like on a client? We boot up a client device. We can initiate the Pixie process, sped up just to make this go a little faster. Choose that task sequence that we just created. And that starts the task sequence where we format the disk, then download and apply the operating system using peering. After that, we can download and apply drivers and then reboot into the new OS. The new OS goes through the specialization process and then initiates the setup complete, which kicks off the task sequence again. It installs the runtime files that we need and then continues on with the task sequence to install applications and updates and anything else you wanted to add in there. Install Office, and then the task sequence is complete. We can then log on using Active Directory credentials and presto, we're at the desktop. Obviously, in real time, that takes a little bit longer than a minute and a half, but easily within 10 to 15 minutes, we can get the machine fully built and at the desktop. All dependent on network speeds, of course, and how big your images are, but just with the standard Microsoft 5 gigabyte image, it's reasonably quick. There's more that we want to add in still. We have the basics for debugging included already. You may have seen in the last demo, we showed how to pause and resume a task sequence using the debugger engine that's built in. We need to build a full UI for that, which is something still on the list. We want to be able to support Enter ID join the same way we do that offline Active Directory join. And we're hoping to add in support for provisioning on Wi-Fi. Now, of course, in the provisioning over Wi-Fi case, you don't initiate that process necessarily using Pixie. So you may need to use USB media to initiate that, but at least you should be able to then make a Wi-Fi connection and do the rest of the process over Wi-Fi. We've added in the ability to build and capture images, so we can, the same way, create a build and capture task sequence just by adding from a template, choosing our build and capture template. Again, editing the task sequence to then specify the OS that we want to use as the base. Specify image index 3 because we want enterprise. We can then add one or more apps that we want to configure. So we'll just add in the applications that we already had. Drag and drop them into the right place. I know it's weird to install MDT in a task sequence, but it's a nice, easy MSI install. So it's just basically a placeholder app. And we can install Office. And add a third app in there as well to install Power Toys. Basically, you can add as many apps as you want. We can install them in the order that you specified. We can handle reboots in between them based on the exit code of the processes. So you could easily reboot and continue for any more complex app installation processes. At the end, we just specify the place that we want to place the uploaded image. So we just directly upload the captured image back to a content item in DeployR. So it's then immediately available to deploy. So makes it nice and easy to basically have a full cycle to build the image, upload the image, have it added to DeployR, all completely automated. And then you have a separate task sequence to take that uploaded image and deploy it out to a test machine to try it. So really easy to do overall. Process then, the build process will choose that task sequence. Again, format, apply the OS, download it. Apply it. No drivers to worry about in this case because you always build images in a VM. VM boots up, continues the task sequence, installs any updates that you want. Fully notes from Windows Update. After the updates are installed, then we can install the applications. Once the applications are installed, then we just sysprep, reboot to Windows PE, and capture an image from there. So pretty much completely automated. That doesn't mean the whole process is 100% complete. Yes, we've proven that we can do the end-to-end flow and everything works out great, but the image that we end up with is a bit on the large side still. So if you take a 5 gig image that is provided by Microsoft and then add in updates and Office and other things, the hope would be that you end up with the image that's somewhere around 8 gig, because Office is about 3. Typically, it ends up being more like 9. So there is some additional work that we plan to put in to reduce the size by cleaning up some of the Windows Update residue, and additionally some work that we'd like to do to make sure that the sysprep process doesn't fail due to app updates installing. So there's some things that we can do in there just to make it more foolproof. We can also prepare devices for autopilot. Obviously, we don't care how the final provisioning of the device is performed. So if you want to use Intune and autopilot to do that, great. But we'll help you get the OS on the device in the first place. So we can create a task sequence to do that that will download the operating system from Windows Update, download the drivers from the OEM, and then boot into Ubi. and let Autopilot take over from there. So we can choose from Windows 10 or 11, choose what Windows version we want, specify the language, what SKU we want to deploy, architecture, x64 or ARM64. We don't need an unattend. We'll automatically, in this case, boot to UBI since there's none. But that's the entire task sequence. It's super simple to just format, apply, inject drivers, and reboot. So if we then go to a device, we'll see that process go through. But the idea is that we'll let Autopilot then take over to do the remaining process. So we can boot from Pixie or Media, choose that task sequence, format, download, apply, download drivers directly from the OEM and extract those, inject them into the OS, and then we're done. We then reboot into UBI, and from that point on, it's a standard Autopilot process. Now, in this particular case, my machine was pre-registered with Autopilot, so there was nothing else to do, but we do want to provide some actions or steps to automate that process to make it easier to register a device with Autopilot on the fly, whether that's for using a hardware hash for Autopilot v1 or a corporate device identifier for Autopilot v2. We want to do that automated and securely. So the securely piece is the hard part there. We can make sure that we do that through our DeployR server to make sure that there are no credentials or app secrets or anything else like that transmitted down to the client to do that. Instead, we let our server manage access to all of the Entra and Intune resources to do that. There are also customers out there that, as they're preparing a device for Autopilot, they're doing a bare metal provisioning process and then turning around and doing Autopilot pre-provisioning before resealing the device and giving it to the end user to let them finish it up. We realized that you can do the same basic thing using a task sequence to do the pre-provisioning steps directly. So we can create a pre-provisioning task sequence, again, choosing what OS and image index we want. We'll dynamically inject drivers, but then we can add in the applications that we want to install. So we'll choose the same apps that we had configured before. But the nice thing here is that we'll use audit mode to drive the process. So the task sequence runs in audit mode, it installs the apps, and once all of those apps are installed, it can then reboot into the normal out-of-box experience. So you don't need to run sysprep generalize. You can just let audit mode finish and easily resume in the UBI process. The only limitation when you're using audit mode is you can't install OS updates during audit mode. So those would have to wait until later, but Microsoft will be taking care of those during UBI as part of the post-autopilot steps inside of UBI. But for right now, we don't put a install update step into the task sequence because it would just fail anyway. So that gives us the ability to avoid the time-consuming generalization. We don't need to do any auto logon or local passwords. We can reseal the OS when it's done. Works great for Autopilot v1 or v2. From our perspective, we're doing everything before UBI starts. So what happens once you're in UBI doesn't matter. Since we're installing apps using the same Intune packages and command lines, later, when you go through the Autopilot flow, Intune will see that the apps are already there, and it will say, oh, since they're already there, I don't need to download them and install them. So the user process then completes very quickly. The other advantage is you don't need to worry about stale objects in Entra or Intune because the device doesn't join or enroll until the user gets the device. So we can do all of this provisioning process without joining the device to anything. So it's basically pre-enrollment. And then the user, when they get the device and go through the Entra ID join or Active Directory join and the Intune enrollment, then the objects are created and activated. So that works out pretty well if you're into pre-provisioning devices and then letting them sit on the shelf for a while. You can avoid problems with the device's objects being deleted while it's sitting around. NetFlow then, boot up the device, we choose that task sequence, and it's pretty much exactly what we had seen before. The big difference is that we'll continue on through the autopilot process once we get into the new OS. So we'll download and apply the OS. Download the driver pack and inject those drivers. Boot into the new OS into audit mode, where we can resume the task sequence. Enable branch cache. We'll install the applications. Task sequence completes. Now we go through UBI. This is an Autopilot v2 machine, so I'll put in my Entra ID and password. The device gets joined to Entra and enrolled in Intune. Now Autopilot is just waiting for confirmation that all the apps have been installed. It sees that they are, so it completes in like 3 minutes. After that's done, we're logged on as the local user and we're at the desktop on a fully configured machine. So again, it can take 10 to 20 minutes depending on the amount of time that it takes to download that OS image and the apps that you're installing. But it's effectively about 70% of that time is IT technician driven to do the pre-provisioning process. Then they would maybe even shut the machine down, hand it off to the user at some later point, and then they do the last 30%. So getting the device up and running in about 3 minutes once they boot the device and get it going. Same as before, we could also dynamically and securely register the devices with Autopilot as part of that process. It's something that we've done a proof of concept of. We just need to integrate that into the DeployR process. All right, let's talk availability. That's always the big question. When? We are currently in the second quarter of 2025. So our hope is that we will be testing with existing 2Pint customers in the very near future and expanding out from there. We're hoping that we'll have expanded beta in the third quarter and then be ready to release hopefully by the end of 2025. Community option won't be available initially. We expect that to be available later, but the hope is that we'll have that available well in advance of the release so that we have validation of that for community customers as well. For anyone that's interested, obviously contact us, let us know what you'd like to see, what's the critical functionality that you would like, and anything unique about your environment that we should be aware of to make sure that we get the best beta coverage from customers that we engage with. But that's the main goal overall.
Yeah, and I think there is an element here as well. Like we're taking ultimately the whole Stifler platform and condensing down into what we previously wanted to release was like the Stifler visualizer that only didn't actually make lots of changes on your network and etc. But there is potentially another alternative is like that might make us get to a releasable stage for the community ahead of time, which is to to not include the stifler client in some of these logic. But how and what that would look like and what we have time to actually test is a little bit unknown at this stage. I think if you skip forward, there is a bunch of things that we've done that have completed, or some of our are completed, but doesn't mean that we're going to stop there, but at least in a demoable or sort of semi-working state. One of the pieces that we're working on is, of course, the RBAC side of things. So we've been getting feedback from customers what they wanted the RBAC model to look like. One of the things that we didn't think about that came up was a lot of the enterprises have basically external QA testing for their driver management. So for instance, the Dell technicians are working on their Dell machines to make sure that the driver packs are working, and that's something that Dell is offering as a service. They wouldn't want the technicians to be part of the system, but obviously not having the right to wipe every single device in the organization. So we're working on defining those things as we completing the RBAC for the first pieces in the Stifler platform, which is for the remote tools and those pieces. We'll continue on the RBAC. The next element will probably be DeployR that will get the RBAC integration piece. The other part is the content source repository. I think we pretty much agree how it's going to work, but it's a bigger kettle of fish because we want the same flow for all of the sort of content and sharing across customers that we offer, not only for DeployR, so also for reports and all sorts of other data for the whole platform. And then in the bottom there are sequence history DB as well that just gone into the Stifler platform for our 2.14 release. So all of the executions are in the database, including the actual step time and how long those time took to actually execute, including what was download time for that, etc. And the execution pieces. What we haven't done, if you skip forward to the next slide, is the reporting on that data. So that's hopefully soon to follow. But one of the big pieces that is stopping a lot of the work is basically what we call groups. Groups is sort of a merge between Entra ID groups, Active Directory groups, and Configuration Manager collections. But basically a way to group entities together, whether it's devices, users, or a logical set of something, right? So as it's a little bit loosely defined, it's also a little bit hard to get up to the point, but in 2.14 we do ship the group concept in the database. We don't have the UI element for it yet, but so that's probably will be done during the summer here to start defining what that looks like. But as we then have that, we will have the ability to automatically create both static and dynamic device groups so that you can then set variables for if you want to determine that this machine is an HP machine, it should then get these variables, these applications, etc. Linked with groups, there's also our device roles, i.e. which applications or settings should a user that works in finance in Kentucky get versus somebody who works in finance in Italy. We're speccing that out as we speak, whether we will complete that in the summer or at the fall, most likely sort of fall times. Then we have some minor things like secret variables to be able to put license keys, etc., and other things into the system that don't get logged in the log text. Also completing basically the secure device AD join in a better way, i.e. not putting a username and password. I think we have 3 versions of that internally. Which one that we're going to go with, we haven't decided. Client push is also something that we're wanting to offer, and that is waiting for the group. So you can actually create a group that contains all of your Windows 11 machines, and then you can basically push Windows 12 to them using a sequence. And then we have a lot of work around the application integration. There's a lot of things that we're working on there. With that comes content locations. If we are integrating with other types of application providers, such as Winget or other types of companies, that content we would probably want to store on their CDNs and in their repositories. So how that is going to look, we haven't really decided. And then we have the big piece, which we've pretty much know how we want to build it, is the user-driven sequence. And when we're saying the user-driven sequence, it's basically the way that we're wanting to do it is we want to take the web UI that we have to build sequences to be also driving the sequence itself, so that you can have a special step in the sequence that will provide the UI with the drop downs and things that you actually built in the web UI itself, so that you can build your own user-driven installation. So for instance, if you want to integrate with ServiceNow or any other asset tracking system or database or with Entra ID groups or whatever, you can basically build this yourself and manage this yourself within the system. You don't have to compile any code or do anything like that. So it's basically being able to build in the system sort of what the MDT UDI builder had, but a webified version of that. And as it's part of the sequence, it will allow you to go sort of back and forward as well and changing things. And as you're doing that, it will update all of the deployment variables as well. I think that's it. Any other questions on things that we're looking to do? I think we're going into the Q&A now, Michael, aren't we?
Yep. And we're basically right at the hour. Obviously, we can continue with any other questions as long as people have them.
I got a question about installing updates as part of the sequence, Michael. Something that you love to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can use the standard Windows update detection and installation automation. So our install update step in the task sequence just does the PowerShell commands necessary to do that. It's by default going to pull from the default update source, which would be Windows Update. If you wanted them to come from WSUS or somewhere else, we don't currently have a simple way of configuring that, but it wouldn't be hard for us to add in some additional logic to configure a WSUS server. It gets more interesting if you're trying to do like a auto patch or Windows Update for Business, something like that, in a task sequence that's pre-Intune. So our options are limited there, but at least when it comes to Windows Update directly and WSUS, those are pretty easy to do.
Question about reboot back into WinPE. I assume they're asking about going from WinPE back to WinPE.
Yeah, we had to first handle Windows PE to the full OS to do any sort of bare metal. And then the build and capture required going from the full OS back to Windows PE. So we can obviously do that. Now, if you wanted to do like a Mike Terrell firmware update, boot back and forth multiple times scenario, we haven't proven that out yet to make sure that we could go from, say, full OS to PE to full OS to PE to full OS. But in theory, we should be able to handle any scenario like that. There are plenty of gotchas around BitLocker and other things that could get in the way of that, but I think the general process is reasonably well understood.
Yeah, I think most people are interested in going P to P to do the likes of bias settings and configuration, like fixing the TPM, right? And then doing the BitLocker piece after. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone going P to full OS, then back to P. I'm sure somebody's been crazy enough to do it. Well, I guess a build and capture would be that, wouldn't it? Duh.
Yeah. Doing it more than PE to full OS to PE is starting to get into the complex scenarios of where we would want to understand what are you trying to prove.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, everyone. I don't think we have much more questions. If you haven't gotten your answer, we'll try to collect them at the end of the webinar, but we might be hanging around if somebody has other questions, but we'll probably stop the recording now. Thank you so much for attending, and thank you so much, Michael, for taking your time to put this together and take us through it.
Sounds great. Obviously, you can always find us on Reddit, other social media sites. So if there are any other questions, find us there.